The American YAWP, Chapter 18, The Progressive Era. Section 1, Introduction. Never in the history of the world was society in so terrific flux as it is right now, wrote Jack London in The Iron Heel, his 1908 dystopian novel in which a corporate oligarchy comes to rule the United States. He wrote, "The swift changes in our industrial system are causing equally swift changes in our religious, political, and social structures. An unseen and fearful revolution is taking place in the fiber and structure of society. One can only dimly feel these things, but they are in the air now, today. The many problems associated with the Gilded Age, the rise of unprecedented fortunes and unprecedented poverty, controversies over imperialism, urban squalor, all but open war between capital and labor, loosening social mores, unsanitary food production, the onrush of foreign immigration, environmental destruction, and the outbreak of political radicalism confronted Americans. Terrible forces seemed out of control, and the nation seemed imperiled. Farmers and workers had been waging political war against capitalists and political conservatives for decades, but then, slowly, toward the end of the 19th century, a new generation of middle-class Americans interjected themselves into public life and advocated new reforms to tame the runaway world of the Gilded Age. Widespread dissatisfaction with new trends in American society spurred the Progressive Era, named for the various progressive movements that attracted various constituencies around various reforms. Americans had many different ideas about how the country's development should be managed and whose interests required the greatest protection. Reformers sought to clean up politics. Black Americans continued their long struggle for civil rights. Women demanded the vote with greater intensity, while also demanding a more equal role in society at large. And workers demanded higher wages, safer workplaces, and the union recognition that would guarantee these rights. Whatever the goals, reform became the word of the age, and the sum of their efforts, whatever their ultimate impact or original intentions, gave the era its name. Section 2, Mobilizing for Reform. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in Manhattan caught fire. The doors of the factory had been chained shut. To prevent employees from taking unauthorized breaks, the managers who held the keys saved themselves but left over 200 women behind. A rickety fire ladder on the side of the building collapsed immediately. Women lined the rooftop and windows of the 10-story building and jumped, landing in a mangled, bloody pulp. Life nets held by firemen tore at the impact of the falling bodies. Among the onlookers, women were hysterical, scores fainted. Men wept as, in paroxysms of frenzy, they hurled themselves against the police lines. By the time the fire burned itself out, 71 workers were injured and 146 had died. A year before, the Triangle workers had gone on strike demanding union recognition, higher wages, and better safety conditions. Remembering their workers' chief value, the owners of the factory decided that a viable fire escape and unlocked doors were too expensive and called in the city police to break up the strike. After the 1911 fire, reporter Bill Shepard reflected, "I looked upon the heap of dead bodies and I remembered these girls were shirtwaist makers. I remembered their great strike last year in which the same girls had demanded more sanitary conditions and more safety precautions in the shops. These dead bodies were the answer." 3. Former Triangle worker and labor organizer Rose Schneiderman said, "This is not the first time girls have been burned alive in this city. Every week I must learn of the untimely death of one of my sister workers. The life of men and women is so cheap and property is so sacred. There are so many of us for one job, it matters little if 140 odd are burned to death." After the fire, Triangle owners Max Blank and Isaac Harris were brought up on manslaughter charges. They were acquitted after less than 2 hours of deliberation. The outcome continued a trend in the industrializing economy that saw workers' deaths answered with little punishment of the business owners responsible for such dangerous conditions. But as tragedies mounted and working and living conditions worsened and inequality grew, it became increasingly difficult to develop justifications for this new modern order. Events such as the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire convinced many Americans of the need for reform, but the energies of activists were needed to spread a new commitment to political activism and government interference in the economy. Politicians, journalists, novelists, religious leaders, and activists all raised their voices to push Americans toward reform. Reformers turned to books and mass circulation magazines to publicize the plight of the nation's poor and the many corruptions endemic to the new industrial order. Journalists who exposed business practices, poverty, and corruption labeled by Theodore Roosevelt as muckrakers aroused public demands for reform. Magazines such as McClure's detailed political corruption and economic malfeasance. The muckrakers confirmed Americans' suspicions about runaway wealth and political corruption. Ray Stannard Baker, a journalist whose reports on U.S. Steel exposed the underbelly of the new corporate capitalism, wrote, "I think I can understand now why these exposure articles took such a hold upon the American people. It was because the country, for years, had been swept by the agitation of soapbox orators, prophets crying in the wilderness, and political campaigns based upon charges of corruption and privilege which everyone believed or suspected had some basis of truth, but which were largely unsubstantiated. Journalists and other writers shaped popular perceptions of Gilded Age injustice. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, a novel dramatizing the experiences of a Lithuanian immigrant family who moved to Chicago to work in the stockyards. Although Sinclair intended the novel to reveal the brutal exploitation of labor in the meatpacking industry, and thus to build support for the socialist movement, its major impact was to lay bare the entire process of industrialized food production. The growing invisibility of slaughterhouses and livestock production for urban consumers had enabled unsanitary and unsafe conditions. The slaughtering machine ran on, visitors or no visitors, wrote Sinclair, like some horrible crime committed in a dungeon, all unseen and unheeded, buried out of sight and of memory. Sinclair's expose led to the passage of the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. Edward Bellamy's 1888 Looking Backward, one of the most popular novels of the 19th century, enthralled Gilded Age readers. In it, a man falls asleep in Boston in 1887 and awakens in 2000 to find society radically altered. Poverty and disease and competition give way as new industrial armies cooperate to build a utopia of social harmony and economic prosperity. Bellamy's vision of a reformed society enthralled readers, inspired hundreds of Bellamy clubs, and pushed many young readers onto the road to reform. It led countless Americans to question the realities of American life in the 19th century. As Dr. Leet orates late in the book, "I am aware that you called yourselves free in the 19th century. The meaning of the word could not then, however, have been at all what it is at present, or you certainly would not have applied it to a society of which nearly every member was in a position of galling personal dependence upon others as to the very means of life, the poor upon the rich, or employed upon employer, women upon men, children upon parents." But Americans were urged to action not only by books and magazines, but by preachers and theologians too. Confronted by both the benefits and the ravages of industrialization, many Americans asked themselves, what would Jesus do? In 1896, Charles Sheldon, a congregational minister in Topeka, Kansas, published in his Steps, What Would Jesus Do? The novel told the story of Henry Maxwell, a pastor in a small Midwestern town one day confronted by an unemployed migrant who criticizes his congregation's lack of concern for the poor and downtrodden. Moved by the man's plight, Maxwell preaches a series of sermons in which he asks his congregation, "Would it not be true, think you, that if every Christian in America did as Jesus would do, society itself, the business world, yes, the very political system under which our commercial and government activity is carried on, would be so changed that human suffering would be reduced to a minimum?" Now, Sheldon's novel became a bestseller not only because of its story, but because the book's plot connected with a new movement transforming American religion, the social gospel. Emphasizing the need for Christians to be concerned for the salvation of society and not simply individual souls, the social gospel emerged within Protestant Christianity at the end of the 19th century. Instead of just caring for family or fellow church members, social gospel advocates encouraged Christians to engage society, challenge social, political, and economic structures, and help those less fortunate than themselves. Responding to the developments of the Industrial Revolution in America and the increasing concentration of people in urban spaces, with its attendant social and economic problems, some social gospelers went so far as to advocate a form of Christian socialism, but all urged Americans to confront the sins of their society. One of the most notable advocates of the social gospel was Walter Rauschenbusch. After graduating from Rochester Theological Seminary in 1886, Rauschenbusch accepted the pastorate of a German Baptist church in the Hell's Kitchen section of New York City, where he confronted rampant crime and stark poverty, problems not adequately addressed by the political leaders of the city. Rauschenbusch joined with fellow reformers to elect a new mayoral candidate, but he also realized that a new theological framework was needed to reflect his interest in society and its problems. He revived Jesus' phrase, "the kingdom of God," claiming that it encompassed every aspect of life and made every part of society the purview of the proper Christian. Like Charles Sheldon's fictional Reverend Maxwell, Rauschenbusch believed that every Christian, whether they were a business person, a politician, or a stay-at-home parent, should ask themselves what they could do to enact the kingdom of God on earth. The social gospel is the old message of salvation, but enlarged and intensified. The individualistic gospel has taught us to see the sinfulness of every human heart and has inspired us with faith in the willingness and power of God to save every soul that comes to him. But it has not given us an adequate understanding of the sinfulness of the social order and its share in the sins of all individuals within it. It has not evoked faith in the will and power of God to redeem the permanent institutions of human society from their inherited guilt of oppression and extortion. Both our sense of sin and our faith in salvation have fallen short of the realities under its teaching. The social gospel seeks to bring men under repentance for their collective sins and to create a more sensitive and more modern conscience. It calls on us for the faith of the old prophets who believed in the salvation of nations. Glaring blind spots persisted within the proposals of most social gospel advocates. As men, they often ignored the plight of women. Most refused to support women's suffrage. Many were also silent on the plight of African Americans, Native Americans, and other oppressed minority groups. However, the writings of Rauschenbusch and other social gospel proponents had a profound influence on 20th century American life. Most immediately, they fueled progressive reform, but they also inspired future activists, including Martin Luther King Jr., who envisioned a beloved community that resembled Rauschenbusch's kingdom of God. Section 3, Women's Movements Reform, opened up new possibilities for women's activism in American public life and gave new impetus to the long campaign for women's suffrage. Much energy for women's work came from female clubs, social organizations devoted to various purposes. Some focused on intellectual development, others emphasized philanthropic activities. Increasingly, these organizations looked outward to their communities and to the place of women in the larger political sphere. Women's clubs flourished in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the 1890s, women formed national women's club federations. Particularly significant in campaigns for suffrage and women's rights were the General Federation of Women's Clubs, formed in New York City in 1890, and the National Association of Colored Women, organized in Washington, D.C. in 1896, both of which were dominated by upper-middle-class, educated Northern women. Few such organizations were biracial, a legacy of the sometimes uneasy mid-19th century relationship between socially active African Americans and white women. Rising American prejudice led many white female activists to ban African American women from their organizations entirely. Black women produced vibrant organizations that could promise racial uplift and civil rights for all Black Americans, as well as equal rights for all women. Black abolitionist Mary Jane Richardson Jones organized Black women in Chicago around settlement work, moral uplift, and suffrage. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who had also worked for abolition and suffrage, worked with club women in Boston and organized in 1895 the First National Conference of the Colored Women of America. The following year, Mary Church Terrell and other Black activists formed the National Association of Colored Women, later known as the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. These leagues of service-oriented women's organizations provided powerful networks to organize and amplify Black women's efforts not only to secure suffrage, but to challenge discrimination and uplift Black communities across the United States. Other women worked through churches and moral reform organizations to clean up American life, and still others worked as moral vigilantes. The fearsome Carrie A. Nation, an imposing woman who believed she worked God's will, won headlines for destroying saloons. In Wichita, Kansas, on December 27, 1900, Nation took a hatchet and broke bottles and bars at the luxurious Carrie Hotel. Arrested and charged with causing $3,000 in damages, Nation spent a month in jail before the county dismissed the charges on account of a delusion to such an extent as to be practically irresponsible. But Nation's hatchetation drew national attention. Describing herself as a bulldog running along at the feet of Jesus, barking at what he doesn't like, she continued her assaults, and days later she smashed 2 more Wichita bars. Few women followed in Nation's footsteps. Many more worked within more reputable organizations. Nation, for instance, had founded a chapter of the Woman's Christian Temperance Union, but the organization's leaders described her as unwomanly and unchristian after her hatchetation. The WCTU was founded in 1874 as a modest temperance organization devoted to combating the evils of drunkenness. But then, from 1879 to 1898, Frances Willard invigorated the organization by transforming it into a national political organization, embracing a do-everything policy that adopted any and all reasonable reforms that would improve social welfare and advance women's rights. WCTU women worked to alleviate urban poverty, pursued prison reform, championed the 8-hour workday, pushed for child labor laws, advocated home protection, and fought for several other progressive causes. Temperance, and then the full prohibition of alcohol, however, always loomed large. The American YAWP, Chapter 18, The Progressive Era. Many American reformers associated alcohol with nearly every social ill. Alcohol was blamed for domestic abuse, poverty, crime, and disease. In 1912, for instance, an anti-Saloon League publication presented charts indicating comparable increases in alcohol consumption alongside rising divorce rates. The WCTU called alcohol a home wrecker. More insidiously, perhaps, reformers also associated alcohol with cities and immigrants, necessarily maligning America's immigrants, Catholics, and working classes in their crusade against liquor. Still, reformers believed that the abolition of strong drink would bring about social progress, obviate the need for prisons and insane asylums, save women and children from domestic abuse, and usher in a more just and progressive society. Perhaps no American reformer matched Jane Addams in fame, energy, and innovation. Born in Cedarville, Illinois, in 1860, Addams lost her mother by age 2 and lived under the attentive care of her father. At 17, she left home to attend Rockford Female Seminary. An idealist, Addams sought the means to make the world a better place. She believed that well-educated women of means, such as herself, lacked practical strategies for engaging everyday reform. After 4 years at Rockford, Addams embarked on a multi-year grand tour of Europe. She found herself drawn to English settlement houses, a kind of prototype for social work in which philanthropists embedded themselves among communities and offered services to disadvantaged populations. After visiting London's Toynbee Hall in 1887, Addams returned to the United States and in 1889 founded Hull House in Chicago with her longtime confidant and companion, Ellen Gates Starr. The settlement is an experimental effort to aid in the solution of the social and industrial problems which are engendered by the modern conditions of life in a great city. It insists that these problems are not confined to any one portion of the city. It is an attempt to relieve, at the same time, the overaccumulation at one end of society and the destitution at the other. It must be grounded in a philosophy whose foundation is on the solidarity of the human race, a philosophy which will not waver when the race happens to be represented by a drunken woman or an idiot boy. Hull House workers provided for their neighbors by running a nursery and a kindergarten, administering classes for parents and clubs for children, and organizing social and cultural events for the community. Americans founded hundreds of such settlements all across the country. Many targeted immigrant communities. San Francisco's Mission Home, for instance, helped Chinese victims of human trafficking, an unintended result of the onerous restrictions on Chinese immigration. Women's clubs in Kentucky sponsored the Heinemann Settlement School for Appalachian Peoples. Ida B. Wells's Negro Fellowship League provided social services to Southern black migrants in Chicago. Service and settlement homes encouraged greater social engagement. Reformer Florence Kelley, who stayed at Hull House from 1891 to 1899, convinced Adams, for instance, to move into the realm of social reform. Hull House began exposing conditions in local sweatshops and advocated for the organization of workers. She called the conditions caused by urban poverty and industrialization a social crime. Hull House workers surveyed their surrounding community and produced statistics on poverty, disease, and living conditions. Adams began pressuring politicians. Together, Kelley and Adams petitioned legislators to pass anti-sweatshop legislation that limited the hours of work for women and children to 8 per day. Like many reformers, Adams, an upper-class woman, refused to embrace more radical policies. While Adams called labor organizing a social obligation, she also warned the labor movement against the constant temptation towards class warfare. Adams, like many reformers, favored cooperation between rich and poor and bosses and workers. Whether cooperation was a realistic possibility or not, Adams became a celebrity. In 1912, she became the first woman to give a nominating speech at a major party convention when she seconded the nomination of Theodore Roosevelt as the Progressive Party's candidate for president. Her campaigns for social reform and women's rights won her headlines, and her voice became ubiquitous in progressive politics. Adams's advocacy grew beyond domestic concerns. Beginning with her work in the Anti-Imperialist League during the Spanish-American War, Adams increasingly began to see militarism as a drain on resources better spent on social reform. In 1907, she wrote Newer Ideals of Peace, a book that would become, for many, a philosophical foundation of pacifism. Adams emerged as a prominent opponent of America's entry into World War I. She received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. It would be suffrage, however, that would mark the full emergence of women in American public life. Generations of women, and occasionally men, had pushed for women's suffrage. Suffragists' hard work resulted in slow but encouraging steps forward during the last decades of the 19th century. Notable victories were won in the West, where suffragists mobilized large numbers of women, and male politicians were open to experimental forms of governance. By 1912, 9 Western states had passed suffrage amendments to their constitutions. Women's suffrage was typically entwined with a wide range of reform efforts. Many suffragists argued that women's votes were necessary to clean up politics and combat social evils. By the 1890s, for example, the WCTU, then the largest women's organization in America, had endorsed suffrage. An alliance of working class and middle and upper class women organized the Women's Trade Union League in 1903 and campaigned for the vote alongside the National American Women's Suffrage Association, a leading suffrage organization composed largely of middle and upper class women. WTUL members viewed the vote as a way to further their economic interests and to foster a new sense of respect for working class women. What the woman who labors wants is the right to live, not simply exist, said Rose Schneiderman during a 1912 speech. The worker must have bread, but she must have roses too. Many suffragists adopted a crueler message. Some, and not just in the South, argued that white women's votes were necessary to maintain white supremacy. Many white women argued that enfranchising white upper and middle class women would help counteract black voters. Chinese American, Native American, Mexican American, and African American suffragists generally labored for suffrage outside the major white-dominated suffrage associations. But whether conducted in the name of gender equality, class politics, or white supremacy, the suffrage campaign was winning. In 1890, 2 suffrage organizations united to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA, and breathed new life into the national movement under the leadership of Susan B. Anthony and Carrie Chapman Catt. Meanwhile, tensions divided activists. Would they embrace moderate means of persuasion under the guise of respectability or push for a national amendment through direct action? On March 3, 1913, the day before President-elect Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns of NASA's Congressional Committee organized an 8,000-person suffragist parade, the woman suffrage procession, down the streets of Washington, D.C. Paul, an advocate of direct action, had learned from the British suffrage movement that processions garnered publicity. The suffragists marched in groups organized by their country, state, occupation, or organization while demanding a federal suffrage amendment. NASA leaders attempted to segregate black suffragists, but Ida B. Wells refused and fell in with other suffragists from Illinois, joining approximately 40 black women who marched with their state delegations or professions. Mary Church Terrell marched with the Delta Sigma Theta sorority from Howard University. Native American Bottineau Baldwin walked with her fellow Washington College of Law graduates. Hecklers chanted, and when some in the crowd turned violent and police failed to contain them, the U.S. Army was called in and the cavalry cleared the path for the suffragists. Some suffragists, vowing never again to be so vulnerable, took self-defense classes afterwards. 25. Still, the parade was a success. Congress began consideration of a suffrage amendment. The final push for women's suffrage came on the eve of World War I. Determined to win the vote, NASA developed a dual strategy that focused on the passage of state voting rights laws and on the ratification of an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Meanwhile, a new, more militant suffrage organization emerged on the scene. Led by Alice Paul, the National Woman's Party took to the streets to demand voting rights, organizing marches and protests that mobilized thousands of women. Beginning in January 1917, Paul and other National Woman's Party members, the Silent Sentinels, as they were styled, began to picket the White House, an action that led to the arrest and imprisonment of over 150 women. Imprisoned suffragists went on hunger strikes. Guards force-fed them. On November 14, 1917, the Night of Terror guards attacked and beat suffragists jailed at the Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia. In March, the D.C. Court of Appeals declared the protests legal and ordered all jailed sentinels to be released. Suffragists were winning at the state and local level and pressuring federal officials. In January 1918, President Woodrow Wilson finally declared his support for the women's suffrage amendment. Congress passed what would become the 19th Amendment the next summer. When it was finally ratified in August of 1920, women's suffrage became a reality. After the passage of the 19th Amendment, women from all walks of life mobilized to vote. They were driven by the promise of change, but also in some cases by their anxieties about the future. Much had changed since their campaign began. The United States was now more industrial than not, increasingly more urban than it had ever been. The activism and activities of these new city denizens also gave rise to a new American culture.